On the morning of March 14, 2019, Judge Michael Henderson woke up screaming in a Miami Beach motel room. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his 58 years of life. When he looked down at his groin area, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The flesh was black, rotting, emitting an odor so foul it made him vomit immediately. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, barely able to dial 911. The paramedics who arrived 17 minutes later would later tell investigators they had never seen anything like it. One of them, a 23-year veteran, actually stepped outside to compose himself before returning to help. The attending physician at Jackson Memorial Hospital would describe the necrosis as aggressive, unusual, and almost deliberate in its progression. But what terrified everyone involved wasn't just the medical mystery. It was the question that kept surfacing as detectives began piecing together the previous night. How does a respected Florida Circuit Court judge end up in a cheap motel room with a woman nobody can identify, suffering from a condition that shouldn't exist outside of extreme medical negligence or deliberate harm? Welcome to Silent Witness True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. In the quiet streets of Coral Gables, Florida, Michael Henderson had spent 32 years building a reputation as one of the most fair-minded judges in the Miami-Dade County Circuit. He presided over family court cases with a patience that lawyers on both sides respected. But behind the black robe was a man slowly unraveling from loneliness he couldn't admit to anyone. His wife of 28 years, Patricia, had filed for divorce in September 2017. The split was quiet, amicable on paper, devastating in reality. Patricia moved to Atlanta to be closer to their daughter and grandchildren. Michael stayed in Miami, in a house that now felt too large, too silent, too full of memories. For months after the divorce, Michael threw himself into work, but eventually the workdays ended, and he had to go home to an empty house. He tried conventional dating at first, but every coffee date felt forced, every dinner conversation strained. So he did what millions of lonely people do. He downloaded a dating app, then another, and another. What started as cautious curiosity became a pattern. Late-night conversations with women whose profiles promised no strings, no judgment, no expectations beyond a few hours of connection. Within 6 months, he was meeting women in hotel rooms, telling himself this was normal, that plenty of people his age were doing exactly the same thing. Most encounters were forgettable, pleasant enough in the moment, hollow afterward. But there were no complications, no drama, until he matched with someone who called herself Marina. Her profile was different. Minimal information, just a few photos that showed a heavy-set woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look through the camera. Her bio was a single line. "I understand what powerful men need." Something about that phrase hooked him. They messaged for 3 weeks before she agreed to meet, insisting on a specific motel in Miami Beach, one of those places that rents rooms by the hour. Michael hesitated, but Marina sent him a message that dissolved his resistance. She wrote that she knew what it was like to be judged, to feel invisible despite being seen by hundreds of people every day. He agreed to meet her on March 13, 2019, arriving at 9:30 inches the evening, his heart pounding. Marina arrived at 9:47. She moved with surprising grace despite her size, carrying a large canvas bag over her shoulder. They talked for nearly an hour before anything physical happened. She asked him questions that felt genuinely curious. What was the hardest decision he'd ever had to make? When was the last time someone had asked how he was feeling and actually waited for an honest answer? Michael found himself answering with unusual candor. He told her about the custody case that still haunted him, about lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering if he'd made the right call. Marina listened without interrupting, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he stopped talking, she touched his hand and told him that power was the loneliest burden anyone could carry. Michael felt something crack open inside his chest. But somewhere around midnight, things shifted. Marina had gone to the bathroom with her canvas bag. When she returned, she was carrying 2 glasses of water, insisting he must be thirsty, pressing the glass into his hand. He drank without thinking, the water tasting faintly metallic. Within 20 minutes, he felt disoriented, the room tilting, Marina's voice seeming very far away. The last thing he remembered was her face very close to his, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered something he couldn't make out. Then everything went dark. When Michael woke up at 6:15 a.m., Marina was gone. The room was meticulously clean, no trace she'd ever been there except a faint chemical smell. He felt groggy, his head pounding, and then he felt the pain. At first, just discomfort, then burning, then agony. When he looked down, he saw the blackened flesh that would leave emergency room doctors stunned. The medical team at Jackson Memorial Hospital worked for 7 hours to stabilize him. The necrosis was advancing rapidly, but cultures came back negative for the usual suspects. Then, a lab technician examining tissue samples called over a colleague. There were larvae in the necrotic tissue, not from environmental exposure, but something that suggested deliberate introduction of biological material. The head of infectious disease called the police. This wasn't a medical emergency anymore. This was a crime scene. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at 2:30 p.m. She interviewed Michael as soon as he was conscious, watching his face cycle through shame, confusion, and horror. Officers searched the motel room but found it professionally cleaned. Every surface wiped down, no fingerprints except Michael's. The motel's security cameras showed Marina arriving and leaving, but her face was always angled away from the lenses. The license plate on her car was obscured by mud. She'd paid with cash using a fake name. Marina had done this before. Detective Chen reached out to hospitals across Miami-Dade County, asking about similar cases. What she discovered made her blood run cold. In the past 14 months, there had been 3 other cases of rapid-onset necrosis in adult males, all with the same unusual bacterial markers. The first victim was a corrections officer. The second was a police captain. The third was a county building inspector. All men in positions of authority. All had met a woman through dating apps. All woke up to a nightmare they couldn't explain. When Detective Chen showed them enhanced screenshots of Marina, all 3 men went pale. That was her. Different wigs, different clothing, but the same person. Detective Chen assembled a task force, working backwards from the bacterial strain. The pathology reports indicated an organism rarely seen outside of morgues and funeral homes. A microbiologist at the University of Miami recognized the signature from a research paper about contamination risks in facilities handling human remains. The research had been conducted at the Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office. Detective Chen obtained a warrant for employment records, looking for anyone terminated in the past 2 years. One name surfaced immediately: Carmen Rivera. Age 38. Former morgue attendant. Fired in June 2017 for protocol violations and suspected theft of biological materials. When Detective Chen pulled Carmen's employee photo, the resemblance to Marina was unmistakable. Carmen Rivera's background read like a catalog of systemic failures. She'd graduated from Florida International University with a degree in mortuary science, hoping to become a funeral director, but she ended up as a morgue attendant. According to her supervisor, she was competent, detail-oriented, never complained. But in early 2017, something changed. She filed a harassment complaint against a county building inspector who'd made inappropriate comments. The complaint was investigated, deemed unsubstantiated, quietly dismissed. 2 months later, he won substantias. 2 months later, she filed another complaint about a corrections officer who'd allegedly assaulted her in the parking lot. Again, no witnesses. Again, dismissed. Then came the complaint that broke her. Carmen had been fighting for custody of her 7-year-old daughter. The judge presiding over her case questioned her stability based on the unsubstantiated assault claims. In his ruling, he reduced her custody to supervised visitation only. Carmen was devastated. She began missing work, making mistakes in documentation. 3 months later, security footage showed her removing items from the morgue storage area. When confronted, she refused to explain. She was terminated immediately. Detective Chen tracked down Carmen's ex-husband, Daniel Rivera. He hadn't seen Carmen in over a year. She'd missed visitation appointments, stopped responding to messages, essentially vanished. The last text she'd sent read, "Tell Maria I'm sorry I can't be what she needs. Tell her I'm doing something important, something that will make the world a little safer for her." The task force traced Carmen's bank account activity to a specific branch in Little Havana. License plate readers tracked her vehicle to a residential area near Flagler Street. On March 22, 2019, Detective Chen led officers to a small efficiency apartment above a coin laundry. When they entered, they found a sparse apartment with minimal furniture and one framed picture of Carmen's daughter Maria. But the contents of the closet made investigators step back in shock. There were 14 glass vials, each carefully labeled with dates and initials. 11 contained biological material from the county morgue. The other 3 were empty, their labels corresponding to the 3 previous victims and Judge Henderson. On a small desk, investigators found a notebook. The handwriting was precise, methodical, disturbing in its clinical detachment. Carmen had documented everything. Her plan, her targets, her methods, her reasoning. The notebook began with a list of names. Judge Walter Pierce, Family Court, September 2017, marked with a red X. Then Building Inspector Thomas Crawford, March 2018. Corrections Officer James Murphy, August 2018. Police Captain Robert Delgado, November 2018. And finally, Judge Michael Henderson, March 2019, with a fresh X still drying. But there were 6 more names below these, 6 more men in positions of authority, presumably her next targets. The notebook contained detailed surveillance notes, work schedules, home addresses, even information about family members and personal habits. The most chilling pages explained her methodology and motivation. She wrote about how working in the morgue had taught her that everyone ended up on a cold metal table eventually, regardless of power. She wrote about how the men who dismissed her complaints, who'd taken her daughter away, had used their authority as a shield. She'd initially considered conventional revenge but dismissed it as insufficient. So she decided to make them feel powerless, to have something eating away at them from the inside, just like she'd felt herself rotting while the system ground her down. The biological material from the morgue was poetic, she wrote. These men dealt in life and death decisions every day, acting as if they were above consequences. Now they would carry death inside them. Detective Chen found one more document, a letter addressed to Maria that Carmen had written but never sent. In it, she tried to explain why she couldn't be present in her daughter's life anymore. She wrote that she'd been broken by what happened, and that broken people sometimes did broken things. She hoped Maria would grow up in a world where women were believed when they reported harassment, where having power didn't mean having the right to hurt people without consequences. She knew what she was doing was wrong, that she'd become the very thing she hated. But every time she thought about stopping, she remembered the judge's condescending tone, the building inspector's laugh, the corrections officer's assault that went nowhere. So she continued. Carmen Rivera was arrested on March 23, 2019, at a diner 3 blocks from her apartment. She didn't resist, simply set down her coffee and extended her wrists like she'd been expecting this moment. During interrogation, she confirmed everything in the notebook. She'd used dating apps to find lonely, powerful men who wanted discretion. She'd researched their backgrounds, learning to mirror their emotional needs. The drugging ensured they didn't remember the contamination, creating confusion and shame that delayed them seeking help. She'd applied the biological material directly to genital tissue, knowing the area's warmth would accelerate bacterial growth. She'd cleaned crime scenes meticulously because she'd learned from documentaries that evidence convicted people, not suspicion. And she'd targeted genitals specifically to make the men feel ashamed, to experience the same reluctance assault victims felt about coming forward. The trial began in October 2019 and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the notebook, the biological materials, victim testimony, security footage, DNA evidence. The defense argued diminished capacity due to severe trauma and mental illness, presenting evidence of the harassment she'd endured, the dismissed assault, the devastating custody ruling. But the prosecution countered that Carmen's methodical planning over more than a year demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong. This was calculated revenge, not a psychotic break. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Carmen was sentenced to 45 years in prison without parole. Judge Michael Henderson attended every day of the trial. Later, he would tell reporters that what haunted him most wasn't the physical damage, though that required 3 additional surgeries. What haunted him was realizing he'd been so desperate for connection that he'd ignored every warning sign. He thought about the custody case Carmen had referenced. He pulled the file, reading through his own decision with fresh eyes. Had he been dismissive? Had he made assumptions based on her appearance, her job, her pattern of complaints? The decision had been based on evidence presented, but evidence was filtered through people who collected it, evaluated by a judge who brought his own biases. He'd thought he was being fair, but fairness required believing the system worked, that investigations were thorough, that complaints were taken seriously, and he'd seen enough cases to know that wasn't always true. The other victims struggled too. The corrections officer left his job, unable to handle the knowing looks. The building inspector moved to North Carolina for a fresh start. The police captain threw himself into advocacy work, speaking about taking harassment complaints seriously. Each carried scars deeper than the physical damage. Each wrestled with a terrible understanding that Carmen had been right about one thing: power did insulate people from consequences. That didn't justify what she'd done, but it explained why she'd felt she had no other option. Carmen Rivera is currently serving her sentence at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. She's 51 years old now. Her daughter Maria is 18, about to start college. According to Daniel, Maria has never visited her mother in prison, has never responded to the letters Carmen writes every month. Maria is angry, hurt, confused about how to reconcile the mother she remembers with the person who did these terrible things. Judge Michael Henderson retired from the bench in December 2019. He moved to a small town in North Georgia, where nobody knows his history. He volunteers at a legal aid clinic, helping low-income residents navigate family court disputes. He says he approaches each case differently now, more aware of the power he wields, more conscious of how easy it is to dismiss someone's pain when you're sitting on the other side of the bench. He's not dating anymore, says he'd rather be alone than risk his judgment being clouded by need again. But he's also started therapy, working through the loneliness that made him vulnerable, learning that being alone and being lonely aren't the same thing. There's a footnote to this case that didn't come out during the trial. Remember the first name in Carmen's notebook, Judge Walter Pierce, marked with a red X and dated September 2017. Judge Pierce was the family court judge who'd reduced Carmen's custody rights. He died in August 2017 from what was ruled as natural causes, a heart attack in his sleep at age 61. But when Detective Chen reviewed his death with fresh eyes, certain details stood out. Judge Pierce had complained of feeling unwell for days before his death. The autopsy had been routine, finding coronary disease sufficient to explain cardiac death. But Carmen had worked at the medical examiner's office at that time. She would have had access to biological materials, to knowledge about what substances could trigger cardiac events. Detective Chen requested that Judge Pierce's case be reopened, that tissue samples be retested. The medical examiner's office pushed back, citing time, sample degradation, cost, but Detective Chen persisted. The results were inconclusive. Some markers suggested possible foreign substances, but nothing definitive. Still, Detective Chen believes Judge Walter Pierce was Carmen's first victim, that his death wasn't natural, that Carmen had practiced on him before moving on to the non-lethal attacks. Carmen has never confirmed or denied this. When Detective Chen visited her in prison to ask directly, Carmen simply smiled and said that some questions were better left unanswered, that justice meant different things to different people depending on which side of power they stood on. This case raises questions that extend far beyond one woman's violent revenge. It forces us to examine how harassment complaints are handled, how credibility is assessed, how systems designed to protect people sometimes become weapons used against them. It asks us to consider what happens when legal channels fail so completely that people feel they have no recourse except violence. It doesn't excuse what Carmen did, but it does require us to acknowledge the failures that created the conditions for her violence, the cascade of dismissed complaints and disbelieved reports that left her feeling she had no other choice. Think about the corrections officer who allegedly assaulted Carmen. Was he ever truly investigated? Did anyone treat her report with the seriousness it deserved? Or was it easier to dismiss her as problematic, as unreliable? Think about the building inspector who made inappropriate comments. Was his behavior addressed or written off as harmless? These small dismissals accumulate. They teach people that the system doesn't work for them, that power protects itself, that speaking up is futile or even dangerous. And while most people who experience this kind of systemic failure don't turn to violence, some do. Some decide that if they can't get justice, they'll settle for revenge. So, let me ask you, because I genuinely want to know what you think. If you had been in Carmen Rivera's position, complaints dismissed, assault ignored, child taken away, livelihood destroyed, every official channel closed to you, what would you have done? Would you have found the strength to walk away, to rebuild somewhere else? Or would you have felt that same rage, that same need to make people understand what they'd done to you? And if you were Judge Henderson, waking up to that nightmare, realizing you'd been targeted because of your position, because of decisions you made that destroyed someone's life, how would you carry that forward? Would you change how you approach your work? Or would you defend your decision as legally sound, even if the consequences were devastating? These aren't comfortable questions. They don't have clear answers. But they're worth thinking about, because cases like this aren't aberrations. They're symptoms of larger failures in how we handle power, how we address harm. If this story has affected you, if it's made you angry or sad or uncomfortable, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments how you would handle a situation where the system failed you completely. Tell me whether you think Carmen Rivera was a victim who became a perpetrator, or a perpetrator who tried to justify her actions by claiming victimhood. Tell me whether you believe Judge Henderson bears any moral responsibility for what happened to him, or whether he was simply an unlucky target of someone else's unprocessed trauma. We'll be covering another case next week that deals with similar themes of institutional failure and individual breaking points. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And as always, thank you for watching, for engaging, for being willing to sit with the uncomfortable complexity of these real-life stories. Justice isn't always clear-cut. Sometimes the victims become perpetrators. Sometimes the perpetrators were victims first. Our job isn't to excuse or condemn, but to understand, to learn, and hopefully to do better.